Out in the great outdoors, you'll find just about anything your mind can imagine. From monsters that shouldn't exist, to people that really shouldn't have any business living out in the woods. You'll definitely find a spook or two exploring the great outdoors. Today, these subscribers sent in what they claim to be allegedly true encounters with things they can't explain deep within the woods and the great outdoors. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you could find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. My goal for October is to have a video or a stream out every single day for this month. So definitely look forward to that. Be sure to subscribe and to have your notifications on so you don't miss any of these videos. Helping me out once again is my good friend Jensen. If you enjoy his voice, be sure to check out his channel. He does great stuff over there. You can find the link to do that in the top of the description. Now, let's get into these creepy stories sent in by viewers just like you. So this happened either last year or earlier this year, before lockdown, I think. It is probably going to be short, as this is the only experience that I have ever really considered odd. So, we own a cabin up in the mountains of Colorado. It is nice and is in a neighborhood that sits on the edge of the woods. That is about as specific as I am going to get. So my dad would sometimes joke with us about gargoyles up there. I feel like this is relevant because of the incident in question. I think a gargoyle might be involved. So, it is late one night, around 10 or something, and I'm on my phone. I share a room with my younger sibling, and they were asleep. Anyways, I am startled by this loud bang in the cabin, feeling like it was shaking. It most certainly was not a hallucination, as both of my parents came upstairs, and I started yelling in confusion. It was a one single bang noise, maybe like thunder. It did not wake up my siblings, but I certainly heard it. I should also note that I sleep up in the loft, so it is basically the top floor, whereas my parents sleep in the basement. Either way, my parents heard it too, so I was not alone. I had asked them what they thought it was, and they had said it was probably an earthquake or something. I did not agree with them, because it felt like I had come from above, like the roof. Again, I could be wrong. I have never been in a place during an earthquake before, so I guess I really wouldn't know. I should also note that we didn't talk to any of our neighbors as far as I'm concerned about the incident, so nothing could really come of it. The thing that I kind of consider evidence to my theory is that sometime later, from what I recall, when we had someone look at the roof for insurance purposes, I recall my parents mentioning the inspector saying there were indentations on the roof, as if somebody was walking up there in metal boots or something of the like. If anybody else has ever experienced something like this, I'd love to hear it down in the comments below.
So, I used to live in a more urban part of Arizona, and I'll come right out and say I have no idea what this thing is. I haven't seen Bigfoot. I'm fairly certain it's not a chupacabra, and I'd be very surprised if it was a Loch Ness monster. So, if anyone has any idea what this thing is, I would very much appreciate the suggestions. But for the sake of the story, I'll call it the camel head. So the first time I ran into camel head was when I was around 15. I lived about a 10-minute walk away from a playground that leads into a big grass field, and behind that field was a rocky strip that was right next to the road, but most of it was blocked off by trees, safe from view. I was really depressed when I was 15, and I'd go there just to be by myself for the moment. And eventually, when I began to develop bulimia, I'd go there to take care of things too. I just didn't have the heart to let my single dad know that I was going through that. So I kept it inside. This one specific nook in the rocky road, where the wall kinda dipped into the inside, was a tight space with an electrical box in the center. It was a place to sit down and empty my stomach from the upper end after my dinner each night, and it became my own little safe corner of the universe. It wasn't until a few months into my bulimia that I'd noticed him, or it, or them, even though I'm fairly certain this thing is a one-off and not a species. The only proof I have is that I've only ever seen one. Anyways, the first time I noticed him was at a distance. I'd walk along the side of the grassy field behind the trees, and he'd always stand just between where the field ended and the rocky road began, almost as if though he was bound to stones that decorated the ground. What always stood out to me were his eyes. His bright, shiny eyes. A very specific shade of orange. I haven't seen before, like if you take the color of copper and brightened it, then shone it like a beacon out of two small holes. He'd always just stand there, watching the park. Whenever he wasn't there, that's when I'd venture out into the rocky road and make my way there to take care of what needed to be done. Every once in a blue moon, though, I'd run into it, and that's when I knew it was more than just me seeing things, just not quite to the extent I thought. I guess I don't know. I feel as if I'm rambling even remembering this. It's just how my brain gets, I guess. He'd always be in the same exact position, crouched over, sitting down with his head slouched down, next overstretched to the side, and just the top of his head visible while it moved behind the electrical box. The eyes on the side of its head's just barely visible. I never knew if it could see me. If it could, it never reacted. Even when I made noise, unless it gnaws on electrical wires, then perfectly hides the evidence, or just eats dirt. The only significant spot of exactly where its head would be was that when it would go, I'd sit on the electrical box right beside where it would be sitting. Never while I'm there, of course, and the evidence of my bulimia would always drop down exactly to that area. It never came on the days when I actually did it, always the days following. There'd even be a few days afterwards when I'd be too scared to even make my nightly hike. And since I couldn't risk my dad finding out, I just forced the meals down. This was pretty routine after a while, me checking to see if Camelhead was there. If he wasn't, I'd do what I needed to do. And if he was, maybe I'd fight somewhere else, or more often than not, just keep it down. Thinking about it now, I noticed that I never really seemed particularly afraid of it. It was only when I had my eyes on it did the fear strike. I don't know if I just loved my dad that much that the threat of seeing some unknown entity didn't even faze me, or if it's something else. I wonder. I do know for sure that one day, the routine I had broke. When I was 16, I was heading out as per usual, and walked on over. Honestly, I was upset. My girlfriend at the time had dumped me and I was an edgy teen, and I was just done with the world. I made my way over, and when I saw Camelhead eating, it didn't really faze me at this time. I believed that maybe stuff was out there, but this was bullshit. Hallucinations, stress-induced visions, based in this area because of what I was going through, and I was done with it. I walked over, began yelling at it, flashlight on to show its dark gray body, and watched as it lifted its head for the first time. I saw the head for which it got its name. If I saw a camel that looked like this, I'd shit myself. But living near the Camelback Mountains, camels are what was on my mind, and the shape was close enough. The eyes, still glowing its bright copper hue, stared right at me, and for the first time, I saw its face. Head, not slender, but conical, ending into a hole that I assumed to be its nose. It only had 4 teeth that I could see, all of them long, tinged with whitish yellow, and shaped like those of rodent, each tooth sitting atop of a lump that surrounded its lipless maw, similar to an alligator's mouth. It had a giant opening in each cheek, or maybe I'd be more accurate to say it had 2 strips of flesh that connected from the middle of its jaw to its skull, and underneath the jaw was where I saw the beginning of a floppy, fleshy neck, like that of an old man's neck. The way it drops down, It's the whole neck that was like that, covered in skin seemingly too large and wrinkly for its body, even though I didn't notice anything like that on its face or body. I turned around and walked off after yelling at it, deciding not to purge my own accord this time. But then I looked back, and it was peering out at me, its long arms extended out, long bony fingers, and in particular, its middle finger stood out. It was longer than the others, but much longer than you'd expect on a human, and it was tipped with a single talon. Still being done with the world, I marched over and began yelling at it, telling it that it wasn't real. And then, when I closed my eyes and crossed my arms, told it to get me, ready for nothing to happen. It touched me. I could tell it was a talon. It scratched me. And that's when I realized it was real, actual danger. The moment I realized what happened, I just stared at it, silently. I guess the noise was what it wanted to stop, because the moment I realized how heavy it was breathing, it lifted its head up to my level, and I began running. I darted out from it and looked back. It was chasing me on all fours, not like an animal, but angled, similar to what I've seen gorillas do. But it wasn't exact, more awkward. But either way, it was fast. I looked back constantly, and once I was halfway across the field, out of the rocky road, it was gone. But I didn't stop. I ran all the way home, and it'd be a long, long time before I'd go back. From then on, I decided to go at dusk instead of the dead of night. And from then on, I rarely saw it, but respected it when I did. The funny thing is, though, when I went back home and saw that part of my arm where it scratched me, it didn't look like a scratch, even though I saw the talon retreat after I opened my eyes. I realized I'd been touched. When I got home and looked down, what I had was a burn mark.
This story happened to me several years ago when I was in the 5th grade, so forgive me if it's not particularly good. My memory is not the best. I was camping with my friend Tim and his brother Michael, whose family had just moved on to a rather large plot of land coated in dense woodland and lots of little streams. As we were young and anxious, we wanted to explore the woods to find a nice little place to build a fort and hang out. So, we headed out into the woods with only sleeping bags and some backpacks with snacks, flashlights, and some warm clothes should it get too cold. We found a nice little clearing that had flat ground, save for the far side that ran steeply down to meet the creek. We set up camp here and had went swimming in the creek where we found some strange animal footprints that looked very close to a human. But these prints were smaller and had only 3 toes. We thought this was weird at first, but quickly it had left our thoughts as we returned to splashing each other and having fun. Come sunset, we were all laying down in the grass watching as the colorful sky darkened and the night's beginning, when we heard a noise coming from the side of the clearing that our camp was at. We were sitting on the hill, so we could not be seen by anything that was on the flat part of the clearing. We brushed it off at first. We thought it was probably a deer or something. But then we heard the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing and sniffing. We cautiously looked over the top of the slope and saw a small dark gray creature, no larger than a chimpanzee, walking around our campsite. I was in shock at first, but I began to grow more and more terrified with every passing moment, till Michael threw a rock into the woods behind the creature, and it scurried off back into the woods. We waited for a couple of minutes before we got up from our cover behind the slope. All our bags had been ripped open, and all of our snacks were now gone or thrown about. On the ground we found footprints all in the mud around our campsite. I got chills down my back and suggested that we leave, but Michael and Tim said they wanted to stay because whatever it was had left, and that it was probably just a deformed coyote or something. I guess I gave in to their pleas, and we decided to stay out, and sometime later we had a fire going once again. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard branches snapping in the tops of the trees nearest our camp. We looked up and saw that thing once again, trying its best to hide after it made noise. We were all pale-faced and decided to run into the woods away from our camp. I heard that thing behind us, but didn't want to look back. I ended up slipping a glance back though eventually. It was not far behind us, so I yelled to stay together so that if it caught up, we could fight it better. Despite my best efforts, we ended up getting split up, and soon I found myself back in the clearing. I had managed to do a full circle back but heard brush breaking behind me, so I dove down the slope and rolled into the creek, trying my best to be quiet. I tucked myself just under the incline of the drop into the creek, and I just tried to slow my breathing as best as I could. I was terrified, cut up, and bruised from my chase through the woods, and now soaking wet. I held my breath as I heard something making its way down the slope towards me. I heard a soft hissing sound and a growl as whatever it was ran back up the slope towards my camp. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes or so, when there was a large splash next to me. I thought it was done for, but I saw it was Tim. What are you doing here?" I asked. "I came looking for you and Michael," Tim said out of breath. "I haven't seen Michael since back in the woods," I replied worriedly. "I thought he was with you." Tim was about to speak when we heard someone making their way through the clearing towards the slope. I thought I was going to be forced to hold my breath again, but Tim stood up and quickly ran to the other side of the creek to escape. I saw his shape fade into the darkness quickly, and I was about to follow when I saw that gray creature jump up into the water just feet away and give chase. It smelled like death, and I could see it well for a short instant. Its flesh seemed to wriggle and squirm like there were worms just under the peeling flesh, and its bony spine looked more like a protrusion than a bone. I was terrified, now more than ever, and my fight or flight instinct kicked in. I know it sounds terrible, but I used this chance to get out of the water and run back to Tim and Michael's house, not too far from where we were camping. Right as I got out of the clearing, I saw Michael. He was ducking behind a tree, and I called his name in a hushed tone. He looked at me and I saw pure relief over his face, and he stood up. "Where's Tim?" he asked worriedly. "He ran the opposite way, and the thing took off after him," I said with tears in my eyes. How long had I been crying? I thought to myself, when suddenly I was knocked off my feet by something. It was Tim, and we all nodded in agreement and ran toward the house. We did not know if we were being chased, but at this point we did not care. We just wanted to get into a safe place. We made it back to their house with no problems, and we all slept restlessly on the floor in Michael's room. This is anticlimactic, but we went back to that place and none of our stuff was there, and we never saw the creature again. I have not talked with Tim or Michael in a couple of years, but I want to talk to them about that night sometime soon if I can. It was near the end of 2018, around November I believe, so it was damp and cold out, but nonetheless still comfortable for me when I got a call from my friend Joe. He wanted to come up to my house and stay a few days to get out of the city, so to speak, because I live up in the mountains. The usual middle-of-nowhere type old wooden house with my mom, who rarely was home for more than 2 to 3 hours at a time due to her job, and the mountains of Tennessee can have some pretty backwoods areas. We have neighbors, but they are a good distance from us, so we don't really know them all that well. Enough details for now, though. So, I get off the phone with Joe, and proceed to the city where of course I and he hung out and played some video games and slightly lost track of time. We left, and thanks to the time of year, it was already dark. It was maybe around 6:30 to 7 when we got back to my place, and it had begun sprinkling rain on the ride up. But we get there with no problem. We go in and start setting up the game stations to begin the night of games and movies, typical stuff we often did. It is around 10 when we have everything set up, and the slight rain had subsided, so we open the window to cool the room. The backyard is dark, and I mean dark, and it leads straight into the woods beside the small shack in my yard. But it never bothered us as we were halfway through our movie when I and Joe both heard a faint metallic-like sound coming from the woods. It caused me and Joe to pause the movie and ask if we both heard the same thing. I said I had, so we listened for a moment, and we heard it again. This time, though, it sounded closer. It was so windy, so we blamed it on the wind, and plus, we have a tin roof, but we resumed the movie and kind of forgot about it. About 30 minutes later, we hear this sound again, but once again, it is much louder than the last. It sounded like someone hitting a metal baseball bat against a tree. So I paused the movie again, and I and Joe looked at each other. We decided to stay quiet and turn the lights down and take a look out the window. We saw nothing, but kept hearing it move around the woods, so to speak. We started getting a little freaked out, but turned the movie back on and lowered the volume, mostly as a ploy to act as if we were ignoring it. But really, we were listening intently to the outside noises, and the sound quickly stopped. They now transitioned to the side of my house, just under the opened window. We froze, and for what felt like 5 minutes just stared at the window, seeing nothing but the darkness and slight glow of the floodlight coming from the side of the house. Soon, we saw a shadow in the light. Then all at once, the light shook and went out. We turned and ran into the front room and grabbed a light and anything we could use as a non-lethal weapon and bolted outside to the area from which the sound was coming from. It was coming from just under the window, but there was nothing. No sound, no light, but my floodlight was unscrewed and on my porch, which really freaked us out. So I quickly put the light back up, and we had a brief look around when it began raining pretty hard. We stopped our search and concluded that whoever or whatever unscrewed that light was gone. We assumed it did not want to stay in the rain, as we did not either. We got back inside, still thinking about what had just happened. As I went to look out the window, I saw what looked like a man standing in the dark looking at me from behind the shack in my yard. I was scared, I would not lie, but I kept talking to Joe as if I did not see him. I walked over to my desk and I calmly took out my 9mm handgun. I had used this for home protection due to previous incidents that we had had. I stow it in my lap and hoped that whoever was outside would leave. It seemed that for another hour or so that the guy was gone, but we heard loud footsteps on my porch near the floodlight, then a series of loud banging on my wall right next to where we were sitting. I stood up and cocked my handgun. When I saw the outside light go out again, I moved to the window and shoved nearly my whole upper body out of the window and fired at least 7 shots right under the outside of the light, and I saw the man run into the woods wildly off into the dark again. Silence and darkness crept over us again the remainder of the night. We kept the lights on and the window shut, and nothing else happened. All has been quiet since. This story takes place 1 year ago when I lived in the backwoods of Georgia. I now live in Wyoming. It is much better here. My name is Patrick. I'm 17 now, but when this happened, I was 16, and this is hard for me to write because it still scares the crap out of me to this day. So, I and my friends Mark, CJ, and Chelsea were going to spend the night together because my brother was at his friend's house and my mom and dad were going to be out of town for the next week. I must note I was 16, Mark was 15, Chelsea was also 16, and CJ was 17. He had his license, and I believe he was the only one out of the group to have it. Because I was living in the backwoods, CJ drove Mark and Chelsea to my house. The first 3 hours were normal. We watched movies, played some PS4 games, and I browsed Netflix until midnight. It was at that point, for at least an hour, we were browsing the r/paranormal subreddit. Mark is a believer, and so am I. Chelsea is too, but I think CJ was more of a skeptic, but we still liked him as he was cool. He is like a more punk rock version of Tom Cruise, and I saved Tom Cruise because he was short, about 5'4". Mark is 5'6", Chelsea is 4'10", and I'm 6'4". I am the tallest. My dad is a Marine. He is a beast at 70, and he is 6'4". I got my height from my dad. Had I not been the tallest and strongest of my friends, I would not be alive today. Here's why. We were sitting there out of nowhere. My dog starts going absolutely nuts. I grabbed my dad's shotgun because my house was on a back road of a back road. The closest other person is probably 5 miles away or more, and my property had no trespassing signs and private property signs all over it. So I looked outside and see nothing. Then I hear a sound that sends chills down my spine even as I write this. I said, "What the heck is that?" CJ comes running outside. I hand him my mom's pistol, and just as we are ready to walk back in the house, I see something run into the woods. Me and CJ run after it, with our guns. We have our flashlights at the ready as well. We run for about 15 minutes, then CJ goes, "Shh, quiet." Then he points at something. It takes me a minute to see what it is. That's when I see it. I open fire and then CJ starts shooting as well. I stop and tell him to stop soon after. We hear a scream coming from the house. Me and CJ sprint back to the house as we hear that god-awful sound again. CJ and I run into the back door. We find Mark and Chelsea in the corner of the room. Chelsea is hysterical and crying and said, "What was that?" We all had a look of shock on our faces, and then I looked at my dog. Sarah is a 10-year-old black lab. She's the best dog ever. I saw her hiding behind my dad's chair. There were 3 long, deep claw marks along her side. We all spent the rest of the night in my upstairs bedroom with all the doors locked. When the sun came up, we went outside with my dad's shotgun and searched the backyard. I found 2 large footprints where I saw the thing run into the woods. I told CJ and Mark, but not Chelsea. I stayed at CJ's place for the next couple of days. Then Mom and Dad came home after dinner. When I and Dad were talking in the living room, I told him about what happened. He said I probably saw a Wendigo. Mark just told me that he had stage 4 cancer. He only has 6 months, so I figured I would share this story. Chelsea and I have been dating for a while now. Next year we turn 18. I plan on asking her to marry me, and I want a big family and lots of kids, but I can't never forget that night. It will be with me until the day I die. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true stories from the outdoors. I don't know about you guys, but that last story definitely freaked me out. And I don't know what I would do if I had some creeper trying to break into my window in the middle of nowhere. I guess I'd have to bring out my 9mm as well and start letting hell rain loose. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button, as the more likes this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it in the algorithm, and that helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's from the outdoors or something different, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. Joining me today is my good friend Jensen. If you enjoyed his voice and his storytelling, please be sure to subscribe to him. You can find the link to do so in the top of the description down below. It would really mean a lot, and it would help him out a lot too. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories and bring them with you everywhere you go. On iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and pretty much everywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. And the best part of it all, it's absolutely free. If you guys want to support the channel outside of hitting that like button and subscribing, maybe check out the merch store. I've got face masks, shirts, hoodies, mugs, and so much more. As I said in the intro of this video, I'm going to try to do 31 days of Halloween for you guys, whether that be a new video or a long live stream every single day of October. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the swamp the way you do. I couldn't do this on a daily basis without you guys. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.